I have lit a candle in honor of the Day of Might. Yes, my friends, welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor and our celebration of the Day of Might. October 23rd, officially the Day of Might. The day, the holiday, which celebrates sword and sorcery fiction. Now, I love sword and sorcery, so I had to talk about this, the Day of Might. I bet you didn't even know there was a holiday that celebrated sword and sorcery. Well, I'm just here to bring you culture. That's what we do here at Stately Vaughan Manor. So, on the Day of Might, you light a candle. Okay, don't burn down the manor candle. You light a candle in honor of the Day of Might, and you're supposed to drink some mead. Or if you don't have mead, you're supposed to drink some beer. I actually don't have alcohol here at Stately Vaughan Manor, which seems like a foolish thing. I don't really drink that much, but I'm thinking of starting. So, maybe I'll start drinking. So anyway, the Day of Might. Now, this was invented by Magician's Skull magazine, at least as far as I understand it was. And I only really know about it because I watch BookTube and because I watch Liam's Lyceum. Liam is the lord of sword and sorcery. If you're interested in sword and sorcery, watch Liam's channel. It's amazing. And he talks about other things too, like fantasy, just regular old fantasy, and science fiction sometimes, and all kinds of other stuff. But man, he knows his sword and sorcery, so check out Liam. Now, sword and sorcery, a little different than kind of like epic fantasy or high fantasy or that kind of stuff. The Lord of the Rings kind of thing with long series and books nowadays that are like 1,000 pages each. Sword and sorcery tends to be a little more focused, a little more adventure-based, usually based on a character or a smaller group of characters than some of the heroic fantasy you might be used to. Doesn't usually have complex magic systems, although sometimes it does, but usually not. The magic is usually all dark and scary. Very often, the stories are dark, sword and sorcery stories, but they're almost always a lot of fun. That's kind of one of the best things about sword and sorcery. It's a fun genre where you have shorter stories or shorter novels that are just fun. There are exceptions to all this, but yeah, basically that's sword and sorcery right there. So I thought in honor of the Day of Might, I would talk about sword and sorcery, and if you're interested in sword and sorcery, I'd recommend you some books and authors. So here we go. The first author I'm going to talk about is Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs didn't write sword and sorcery, but he did write the Barsoom series of novels, his Martian books, also known as the John Carter series, that take place on the planet Mars. John Carter is transported to the planet Mars. And there's not magic in this series. It's still considered kind of a science fiction series, but it has had a lot of influence on sword and sorcery. This was published in 1912, and a lot of the people who write sword and sorcery have read this series, and it's influenced them because there's a lot of monsters in this, there's a lot of daring do, there's tons of sword fights. There's a lot of the kinds of thing that you would find later on in sword and sorcery. So I had to put Edgar Rice Burroughs in here, and specifically the Mars books. A lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs books were written kind of like that, kind of like the Mars series. He wrote his Venus series, which was a lot like the Mars series in that way, although different in other ways. But yeah, definitely. Check out Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter series, his Barsoom series of novels, if you're interested in sword and sorcery. And now we move on to the father of sword and sorcery, Robert E. Howard. Of course, I talk about Robert E. Howard all the time. He deserves it. He's amazing. Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, which was a tremendous series of sword and sorcery stories. Robert E. Howard wrote Conan when he was at the height of his powers and skill as a writer. Excellent series of stories. And if you're going to read Robert E. Howard, I usually recommend you start with Conan. Start with this series when he was at his best. The Conan series is amazing. One of the greatest, if not the greatest series in all of Sword and Sorcery. Certainly the most influential. However, I also would recommend you check out Kull, an earlier hero created by Robert E. Howard. Because the Shadow Kingdom, the first Kull story that was published, is considered by many to be the first sword and sorcery story. In this story, all the elements that you would expect in a sword and sorcery story are there. And it's an amazing story. It's really, really good. And it's a tremendous start for this genre. I would definitely check out that story in particular, and actually all the Kull stories are worth a read. Again, these stories have had tremendous influence on sword and sorcery. Most sword and sorcery writers, most of them, have read Robert E. Howard and been influenced by Robert E. Howard. So yeah, check out Robert E. Howard. Of course, check out Robert E. Howard. But now we're going to move on to a different writer, Fritz Leiber. Fritz Leiber and his Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser books. A really interesting series of sword and sorcery stories, which have a unique flavor all their own. Fritz Leiber definitely has his own style. And these are great adventure sword and sorcery stories about Fafhrd, the barbarian, and the Grey Mouser, the little guy, the thief. They are great stories of character. They're about these two characters and their friendship and their partnership over time and all of their many adventures. Well worth reading. One of the greatest series in all of Sword and Sorcery. Fritz Leiber, who, for a lot of people, when they think of him now, I believe they usually think of his horror stuff. He had a lot of influence on the horror genre as well. He wrote some great horror stories. Also in science fiction. He wrote a lot of science fiction as well. I think ultimately it'll be Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser that he's remembered for. And in many circles he's remembered for this already. And I think that these stories, while very well respected, probably aren't read as often as they should be by modern fantasy readers. That's true of a lot of sword and sorcery, but Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser has had influence outside of just the sword and sorcery subgenre in fantasy. It's had an influence on fantasy. Really interesting stuff. You should definitely check out these stories and novels. You won't be sorry, that's for sure. It's excellent. Now we're going to move on to Michael Moorcock. Michael Moorcock, one of the most celebrated of all sword and sorcery writers, and again, another writer whose work, particularly his Elric stories and novels, have had great influence on all of fantasy. The Elric stuff is magnificent. I mean, these are just great, dark fantasy stories, wonderfully written, truly unique. These stories about Elric the Doomed, Prince Elric, with his sword, Stormbringer, that will suck out your soul and give him strength. Elric is a pretty dark character. And Michael Moorcock was good at that, writing dark characters. But Elric, as great as Elric was, and you definitely, if you're reading Moorcock's fantasy, you're going to want to start with Elric. But he wasn't the only fantasy character that Michael Moorcock wrote. He wrote a lot of fantasy. And you're going to want to check out most of his fantasy, if not all of it, after you read Elric, because really excellent stuff. A lot of this fantasy was based on Michael Moorcock's multiverse. Michael Moorcock had a multiverse before anyone else did, except for maybe DC Comics. But he had his own multiverse, which all centered around usually his Eternal Champion. The Eternal Champion, a character that is reincarnated every once in a while whenever chaos and law needs to be put back in balance. And most of Michael Moorcock's fantasy heroes are incarnations of the Eternal Champion. Elric is, Corum is. A lot of his fantasy heroes are. So he's got this kind of extended universe of fantasy and fantasy characters and fantasy series, all taking place in different realities and different worlds. It's great stuff, man. Once you start, you're probably not going to want to stop reading Michael Moorcock. Great stuff. And we've actually got, Michael Moorcock started Elric, I believe, in the 1960s. And he's got another Elric book coming out later this year. A new Elric novel's coming out. So he's been at Elric for a while, and just such a great character. Definitely want to check out Michael Moorcock. But you're also going to want to check out Kane from Carl Edward Wagner. Kane. Now this is a really dark character. Carl Edward Wagner was really, really good. He was a really good dark fantasy author, really good horror writer. Not read enough, he's not nearly read enough today. He had a big influence on fantasy, particularly grim dark fantasy. His stuff was both grim and very dark. His character, Kane, was certainly a dark character. Not a hero, Kane wasn't. He was more of a villain. Carl Edward Wagner said that he got his inspiration for Kane from those characters in Gothic novels, those dark, mysterious men who were more villains than heroes. Kane is definitely more of a villain than a hero. He's not all bad, but you would never know it from some of the terrible stuff he does. Always really interesting to read, though. A great series of books, the Kane novels and stories, so definitely check out the Kane stuff. He did some more modern day, Kane in the modern day kind of thing. He wrote some of that in the 80s, but that stuff wasn't as good. But definitely check out his 1970s Kane series. Excellent stuff. It's really, really good. I also don't want to forget to talk about C.L. Moore. C.L. Moore's Jarell of Jory, who was a female sword and sorcery character, which was rare back in the day. This character appeared in Weird Tales along with Robert E. Howard's work. A great series of stories featuring Jarell of Jory, who is as tough and strong as any man. Although I think probably because she's a female character, she was allowed to have a wide range of emotions. She felt love, she felt fear, as well as anger and sadness. She was a really interesting character with some truly bizarre stories. I mean, her stories are out there, man. Some of the weirdest sword and sorcery you'll ever read. So definitely check out C.L. Moore's Jory stories. I also don't want to forget to mention this next author, who was unjustly neglected when he was alive and is unjustly neglected now. And that would be Charles R. Saunders, who wrote the Amaro series of stories and novels, originally published by Daw. This was a sword and sorcery series who did sword and sorcery right. These are excellent stories and novels that took place in a fantasy world that, unlike almost every fantasy story that was written at the time that he was writing, it wasn't based on Europe. It was based on Africa. So you have a fantasy world based on Africa, and Amaro is a sword and sorcery hero who is based on he's an African sword and sorcery hero. And it was excellent. Kind of got off to a rocky start despite how good these books were. The first book in the Amaro series originally had, the publisher decided to put a line on there and called Amaro the Black Tarzan. Something along those lines. And then Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated got mad, and they had to take that off and republish the book with a different cover. And many believe that kind of led to a poorer debut of this novel as far as sales go. The sales were never huge on the Amaro series, but that has nothing to do with the quality of the stories themselves. He was writing groundbreaking stuff at a time when nobody else was doing this. Everybody else's fantasy stories were all based on Europe and European kinds of backgrounds, medieval or ancient backgrounds. And his stuff was really good, and he continued to write adventure and fantasy throughout his life. He was a journalist who moved on to do these kinds of stories and this kind of writing. Passed away in 2020. Sadly, like so many other writers who write these kinds of stories, he was sort of forgotten. He certainly kind of had lost a lot of contact, it seems like. He seemed very alone. He didn't have an internet connection. He didn't have a landline. He didn't have a cell phone. So when he would connect with his friends, he usually did it at the library through the library computers. And so he never really was recognized as much as he should have been, I think, for his stories. Definitely check them out, though. I believe there are ebooks of the Amaro stories, so you should be able to find them and read them. It's really cool stuff. There are some honorable mentions here, or depending on how you feel about the stories, dishonorable mentions, but I think they're honorable mentions. We're going to start off with Lynn Carter. Lynn Carter, who was a great fantasy editor. He edited the Ballantine adult fantasy series, which was amazing. But he also wrote fantasy of his own, including Sword and Sorcery, best known for Thongor. But he did a lot of pastiche kind of stuff. You know, he wrote stuff that seemed an awful lot like Edgar Rice Burroughs. He wrote stuff that was a lot like Robert E. Howard. And so, yeah, and then he famous or infamously contributed to L. Sprague de Camp's Conan series, where they added to the Conan series, which was kind of controversial. But at best, Lynn Carter's stuff was a lot of fun. It could be bad. It sometimes was good. It kind of varied in quality, Lynn Carter's work. But his best stuff was pretty enjoyable. Like the early Callisto books were a lot of fun, which were pretty much John Carter pastiche novels. And Thongor, I have a soft spot for. So yeah, Thongor, have to mention Thongor. And as long as we're mentioning characters like this, could we do a video like this and not mention Kothar by Gardner Fox? Gardner Fox, who wrote many, many, many issues of the Justice League and the Flash and a lot of great comic books for DC Comics, also wrote a lot of novels, including this very bizarre barbarian series about Kothar. Not exactly Robert E. Howard. The World is kind of a unique one that he wrote about just fast-paced, fun sword and sorcery stories. Kothar. I have to mention Kothar. And finally, I'd also want to mention John Jakes with Brack the Barbarian. John Jakes, who later became known for the Kent Family Chronicles and the North and South series of historical novels. He wrote these giant historical novels and these very long series of historical novels, and he's well remembered for those. Not so well remembered for Brack and some of the other fun stuff that he did in the earlier portions of his career. Brack the Barbarian, a series of a few novels where Brack is seeking a new life in a new land and just finds adventures all the way through. Brack, definitely have to mention Brack. Also want to mention David Gemmell, because he seems to be a writer, and I've only read a few of his books now. I have a lot of David Gemmell yet to read, but the books I have read are really a lot of fun, and they seem to take some of the spirit of Robert E. Howard's work and some of the other writers of Sword and Sorcery, and he kind of does his own thing with his novels, beginning with Legend, a great novel, a great Sword and Sorcery novel, I definitely highly recommend that. Definitely an author to check out. And I didn't want to finish this video without mentioning David Gemmell. So check his work out after you read all those other writers, or even before. Why not? And there are, of course, a lot of other great sword and sorcery writers and novels and stories out there. If you have your favorites that I haven't mentioned, put them down in the comments below so other people who watch this can see them and check those out too. And I guess that's all I have to say today. I will catch you next time.